"Who shot you?" the Sicilian Mafia boss yelled after she stumbled into him bleeding. The sharp echo of footsteps on cobblestones filled the narrow Palermo street as Giulia ran, her leather boots clicking against the ancient stone. Her lungs burned with each desperate breath, and sweat trickled down her neck despite the cool night air. The street lamps cast eerie shadows that danced along the weathered buildings, their yellow glow doing little to pierce the darkness between them. 3 days. They'd been following her for 3 days now. At first, just watching from afar, but tonight something had changed. Tonight, they meant to finish whatever game they'd been playing. "You can't run forever, Bella," one of them called out, his voice bouncing off the stone walls. Giulia's heart hammered against her ribs as she darted down an even narrower alley, praying it wasn't a dead end. The sound of heavy boots grew closer. Too close. She could hear their labored breathing now, smell the cigarette smoke that clung to their clothes. A cat scattered from her path, knocking over a glass bottle. The crash seemed to echo through the entire street. Giulia stumbled, her ankle twisting slightly on the uneven ground. That split second was all they needed. The crack of gunfire split the night. At first, Giulia felt nothing but pressure, like someone had punched her in the side. Then came the burn, white-hot and spreading across her ribcage. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she hit the cold asphalt hard, skinning her palms as she tried to break her fall. Warm blood seeped between her fingers as she pressed her hand against the wound. The world tilted and swayed around her, the streetlights blurring into golden smears against the dark sky. Her breath came in short, painful gasps. "Finish it," one of the men growled, his boots scraping against the ground as he approached. But before he could take another step, something changed in the air. A presence, heavy and dangerous, filled the narrow street. From the deep shadows between buildings, a figure emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. The streetlight caught his features: sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, and an expression of cold fury that made Giulia's blood run even colder than it already was. She knew that face from newspaper photographs and whispered warnings. Vincenzo Romano, Il Lupo, the wolf, the most feared mafia boss in Sicily, stood before her, surveying the scene with the detached interest of someone examining an insect before deciding whether to crush it. His perfectly tailored suit seemed to absorb the darkness around him. "Who shot you?" His voice cut through the night like a blade, the question clearly a demand rather than a request for information. The men who had been pursuing her scattered like roaches exposed to light, their footsteps fading rapidly into the darkness. One of them shouted something as he fled, but Giulia could barely hear it over the rushing in her ears. Vincenzo moved toward her with deliberate steps, his expensive shoes silent on the asphalt. He knelt beside her, and she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle. His hands were surprisingly gentle as they moved her own away from the wound, but his expression remained unreadable as he assessed the damage. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision as he barked orders to unseen men in rapid Italian. Giulia tried to focus on his face, but everything was starting to blur. The last thing she saw clearly were those dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her shiver despite her fading consciousness. Before you continue listening, comment where in the world are you watching from today. The SUV's door slammed shut as Vincenzo's men hauled Giulia inside. Her side burned where the bullet had torn through her flesh, each bump in the road sending fresh waves of agony through her body. The leather seats stuck to her clammy skin as she fought to keep her eyes open, her vision blurring at the edges. 2 men in dark suits flanked her, their presence suffocating in the confined space. Through the haze of pain, she caught fragments of whispered Italian, the men's voices low and urgent. The cityscape of Palermo whizzed past the tinted windows, familiar streets becoming a dark maze she couldn't navigate. I can't go with you," she managed to gasp, pressing her hand harder against the wound. Blood seeped between her fingers, warm and sticky. "Please, just take me to a hospital." Neither man acknowledged her plea. In the front seat, Vincenzo sat rigid, his broad shoulders filling the space, his silence more threatening than any words could be. The streetlights caught his profile: sharp jaw, straight nose, eyes fixed ahead with predatory focus. Giulia's mind raced despite the fog of blood loss. She knew exactly who Vincenzo Romano was. Everyone in Sicily did. Il Lupo, the wolf, the most dangerous man on the island. Stories of his brutality circulated in whispers, tales of rivals who disappeared without a trace, of empires built on blood and fear. And now she was in his car, at his mercy. She had to get away. The thought pounded through her head with each painful heartbeat. The Mafia wasn't her world. She'd spent her entire life avoiding it, building a normal existence far from the violence and corruption that plagued her city. One bullet had shattered everything. The car turned onto a private road, winding uphill through perfectly manicured grounds. Julia's stomach lurched as the vehicle swayed around curves, the motion intensifying her dizziness. She tried to focus on her breathing, on staying conscious, but darkness kept creeping in at the edges of her vision. High stone walls topped with security cameras lined the drive. Through half-closed eyes, Julia watched an elaborate wrought iron gate swing open, revealing a massive mansion that loomed against the night sky. The architecture was classic Sicilian, but the modern security features were obvious. Cameras everywhere, guards patrolling the perimeter, small red dots of motion sensors blinking in the darkness. The SUV came to a stop in a circular driveway. Before Julia could gather her thoughts, the door beside her opened. Cold night air rushed in, making her shiver. Rough hands grabbed her arms, pulling her from the vehicle. Her legs buckled as they tried to make her stand. Vincenzo emerged from the car in one fluid motion, his tall frame unfolding like a blade being drawn. He turned to face her, and Julia felt the full weight of his attention for the first time. His dark eyes seemed to pierce straight through her, cataloging every detail, measuring every weakness. His expression revealed nothing, but the intensity of his gaze made her want to shrink away. The men holding her arms half carried, half dragged her toward the mansion's imposing entrance. Julia's feet scraped against the stone steps as they ascended. Vincenzo walked ahead, his movements graceful despite his size, like a predator perfectly at ease in his territory. Massive wooden doors swung open, revealing a marble foyer lit by crystal chandeliers. The elegant interior was at odds with the violence Julia knew these walls had witnessed. As the doors closed behind them with a heavy thud, the sound echoed with finality. She was trapped in the wolf's den, and there would be no easy escape. The mahogany door creaked open, to reveal a lavish guest room bigger than Julia's entire apartment. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across silk wallpaper and plush carpets, but the luxury did nothing to ease her racing heart. Her side throbbed with each shallow breath, blood seeping through her fingers where she clutched her wound. "Sit," Vincenzo commanded, gesturing to an antique chaise lounge. When she hesitated, his dark eyes narrowed. Now, her legs trembled as she lowered herself. Onto the velvet cushions. A man in a crisp black suit entered, carrying a medical kit. She recognized him as one of Vincenzo's guards from the car. "Marco will tend to your wound," Vincenzo stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Try anything foolish, and you'll regret it." The guard approached, and Julia instinctively pressed herself deeper into the chaise. Her gaze darted between him and the door, calculating her chances of escape. As if reading her thoughts, Vincenzo moved to block the exit, his massive frame filling the doorway. "Your wound needs treatment," he said, softer this time but no less commanding. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Marco opened the medical kit, pulling out gauze and antiseptic. "I need to see the wound, Signorina." Julia's fingers tightened on her blouse, sticky with blood. With trembling hands, she lifted the fabric just enough to expose the injury. The bullet had grazed her side, leaving an angry red gash across her ribs. Marco worked efficiently, cleaning and bandaging the wound while she bit her lip to keep from crying out. The room's opulence felt suffocating. Gilt-framed mirrors, silk drapes, and antique furniture worth more than she'd make in a lifetime. Everything screamed wealth and power, but also imprisonment. This wasn't a guest room. It was a cage, no matter how beautifully decorated. When Marco finished, he packed up his supplies and left without a word. Vincenzo remained, his dark gaze boring into her. He moved from the doorway, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet as he approached. Julia fought the urge to shrink away as he towered over her. "Now," he said, his voice deceptively soft, "tell me who you are and why those men were chasing you." I'm no one," Julia stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just a woman who was in the wrong place at the wrong time." They were street thugs, nothing more. A cold smile curved his lips as he braced his hands on either side of her, caging her in. The spicy scent of his cologne filled her senses as he leaned closer. His breath was hot against her ear as he whispered, "You'll learn, Bella. No one escapes my world." His proximity made her pulse jump, fear, and something else she didn't want to examine coursing through her veins. Up close, she could see the dangerous grace in his movements, the predatory gleam in his eyes. Every instinct screamed that this man was lethal, yet she couldn't look away from the sharp planes of his face, the full curve of his lips set in a hard line. His fingers gripped her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Those weren't ordinary thugs," he said. "They were trained, professional. So I'll ask you again, who are you?" Julia tried to turn away, but his grip tightened. "I told you, I'm no one important." "Lying to me is unwise, Bella." His thumb traced her bottom lip, the gentle touch at odds with the steel in his voice. "I own this city. Every secret, every whisper, every shadow, they all belong to me. And now, so do you." Julia pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching raindrops chase each other down the window pane. The elegant guest room felt more suffocating with each passing hour. Thick iron bars crossed the windows, beautiful and ornate, but unmistakably prison bars all the same. Her side throbbed where the bullet had grazed her, a constant reminder of how she'd ended up here. The wound had been cleaned and bandaged by one of Vincenzo's men, but the memory of those terrifying moments in the street remained fresh. She traced her fingers along the bars, testing their strength. Solid, immovable, just like the man who'd brought her here. The thought of Vincenzo made her stomach clench, his cold eyes, the way he moved like a predator, how his very presence seemed to steal the air from any room he entered. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the manicured grounds below. 2 armed men patrolled the perimeter, their black umbrellas stark against the carefully maintained gardens. More guards would be stationed at the front gate, she was sure, but there had to be weak spots in their security. Everyone made mistakes. Julia paced the room, her bare feet silent on the plush carpet. The luxury surrounding her was overwhelming. Silk sheets, antique furniture, original artwork on the walls. Everything screamed wealth and power. But it was all just fancy wrapping on a cage. She needed to think clearly. The medication they'd given her for the pain was making her thoughts fuzzy, but she forced herself to focus. The guards changed shifts every few hours. She'd heard the quiet radio chatter through her door, marking the time. If she timed it right, caught them during a handover. Her fingers trembled as she checked the bandage on her side. The wound wasn't deep, but it burned when she moved too quickly. Still, she could run if she had to, and she would have to. Thunder rolled overhead as she cracked open her door, peering into the dimly lit hallway. Empty. Her heart pounded as she slipped out of the room, keeping close to the wall. The mansion was huge, but she'd mentally mapped what she could see of the layout from her window. The back garden had a service entrance, if she could just reach it. Julia moved as quickly as she dared, bare feet silent on the marble floors. Every shadow made her freeze. Every distant sound sent her pulse racing. But she kept going, one careful step at a time. Down the grand staircase, past gleaming suits of armor and priceless paintings, through what looked like a formal dining room. There, a door that had to lead to the kitchen. She could smell coffee brewing. Holding her breath, she eased it open. The kitchen was empty, steam rising from a fresh pot on the counter. Another door stood at the far end, rain visible through its window panel. Freedom was so close she could taste it. Julia darted across the kitchen, ignoring the protest from her injured side. Her fingers closed, around the door handle. She pulled it open, feeling the wet wind on her face. 1 step. 2. The rain soaked through her thin shirt immediately, plastering it to her skin. But she didn't care. Just a few more steps, and she'd be past the garden wall, into the street, away from this beautiful prison and its terrifying master. A shadow fell across her path. Julia's heart stopped as Vincenzo materialized in front of her, blocking her escape. His tall frame seemed to fill the entire doorway, dark suit, immaculate despite the rain. Before she could react, his hand shot out, fingers circling her wrist like an iron band. "You think you can outrun me?" His voice was soft, deadly. She flinched at his touch but said nothing as he pulled her back toward the mansion, the rain continuing to fall around them. The living room was a study in opulence, with crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across Italian marble floors. Julia sat perched on the edge of a leather armchair, her fingers digging into the expensive upholstery. Her side still ached from the bullet wound, a constant reminder of how she'd ended up in this gilded cage. The door opened with a soft click. Vincenzo Romano filled the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the escape route she'd been eyeing. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, a stark contrast to the cruel set of his jaw. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept over her like searchlights seeking weakness. "Sit properly," he commanded, his voice low, but carrying the weight of someone used to absolute obedience. Julia straightened her spine but remained on the edge of her seat, a small defiance, but it was all she had left. "I am sitting." His lips twitched, though whether in amusement or annoyance, she couldn't tell. He moved into the room with the fluid grace of a predator, each step measured and deliberate. The space between them shrank, and Julia fought the urge to shrink back. "You tried to run." It wasn't a question. He circled behind her, chair, and she forced herself not to turn and track his movements. Her heart thundered in her chest, but she kept her gaze fixed straight ahead. "Can you blame me?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You're holding me prisoner." A dark chuckle rumbled behind her. "Prisoner? Look around you, Bella. Does this look like a prison?" "Golden bars are still bars," she shot back, instantly regretting her sharp tongue when his hands came to rest on the back of her chair, caging her in. "You have fire," he observed, his breath stirring the hair near her ear. "But fire can be controlled." Julia's fingers clenched tighter on the armrests. "I'm not something to be controlled." He moved around to face her, his massive frame blocking out the chandelier's light. In the resulting shadow, his features looked carved from stone. "Everything in my world is under my control. The sooner you accept this, the easier things will be." "And if I don't?" The words escaped before she could stop them. Something dangerous flickered in his eyes. He leaned down, placing his hands on either armrest, effectively trapping her in the chair. His cologne enveloped her, expensive and masculine, making her head swim. "You will," he said simply, as if stating an undeniable fact. His right hand left the armrest, and Julia tensed, expecting. She wasn't sure what. Instead, his knuckles brushed along her jaw, the touch surprisingly gentle for hands she knew were capable of violence. The contrast sent an unwanted shiver down her spine. His eyes tracked the movement, and something like satisfaction crossed his features. "You will learn your place here," he murmured, his voice dropping to a tone that seemed to resonate in her very bones. Julia's breath caught in her throat. Her pulse raced, and she hated how her body betrayed her, responding to his proximity with a mix of fear and something far more dangerous. The power radiating from him was overwhelming, his presence filling every corner of her awareness, until there was nothing else. The fire crackled in the massive stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across Vincenzo's face as he stood by the window. His dark silhouette cut an imposing figure against the night sky beyond. Julia sat rigidly on the leather sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching him with wary eyes. "You want to know why I am what I am?" His voice was low, dangerous. He turned from the window, crystal tumbler of amber liquid catching the firelight. "Let me tell you a story, Bella." Julia's breath caught as he moved closer, settling into the armchair across from her. His presence filled the room, making it hard to breathe. "I was 12 when they killed my mother." The words fell like stones into the quiet room. She wasn't involved in the family business, but that didn't matter to our rivals. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes distant. "I found her. Blood everywhere. The carpet was soaked with it." Julia's heart clenched despite, and herself. The pain in his voice was raw, real. "My father." Vincenzo's jaw tightened. He was weak, couldn't protect her, couldn't even avenge her. His knuckles whitened around the glass. "So I learned. I learned everything about power, about control, about making people fear you so much they wouldn't dare touch what's yours." The fire popped and hissed, matching the intensity in his eyes. Julia watched as he stood again, restless energy radiating from him. "By 16, I had killed my first man. By 20, I controlled half of Palermo." He moved to the fireplace, bracing one hand against the mantel. Every step up was paid for in blood, every victory earned through violence. His voice grew quieter, more lethal. "Do you know what it's like, watching the light fade from someone's eyes? Knowing you put it there?" A shiver ran down Julia's spine, but she forced herself to hold his gaze when he looked at her. "I became what I needed to be, what this world demanded." He drained his glass, setting it down with careful precision. The weak die, Bella. The strong survive. And I refuse to be weak. Something flickered in his dark eyes then, a glimpse of old pain, of the boy who had found his mother's body. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual cold mask, but Julia had seen it. Your empire is built on fear, she said softly. But fear isn't the same as strength. His laugh was harsh. No, fear keeps order. Fear keeps peace. He stalked toward her, each step measured. Fear keeps beautiful women like you safe in their beds at night, not running from men with guns in dark alleys. Julia stood, refusing to let him tower over her. And what about trust? Loyalty freely given, not forced? Trust? He spat the word like poison. Trust is for fools and dead men. But there was something in his voice, a hint of longing perhaps, or regret. Julia saw past the monster he presented to the world, saw the scars that had shaped him. You're not the monster. You think you are, she said defiantly, meeting his intense stare. Vincenzo studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then his lips curved in a faint, almost sad smile. We'll see, Bella. The moonlight filtered through the iron-barred windows, casting long shadows across Julia's room. She lay in the massive four-poster bed, silk sheets twisted around her legs from hours of restless tossing and turning. The wound in her side throbbed, a constant reminder of how she ended up in this gilded cage. Every creak of the ancient mansion made her jump. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to the window, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The luxury surrounding her felt suffocating. The antique furniture, the expensive artwork, the plush carpets, everything screamed of wealth and power, of a man who took what he wanted without asking. Julia pressed her face into the pillow, trying to steady her breathing. The events of the day played on repeat in her mind. The shooting, Vincenzo's appearance, being brought to this place. She couldn't shake the memory of his touch when he'd traced her jaw, how something inside her had responded despite her fear. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her freeze. Heavy, deliberate steps that she already recognized. Vincenzo. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the footsteps grew closer, then stopped outside her door. There was no knock, no warning. The handle turned, and he stepped inside as if he owned not just the room, but everything in it, including her. Moonlight caught his sharp features, highlighting the dangerous angles of his face. He wore a black shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, marked with faint scars. His presence filled the room, making it hard for her to breathe. Can't sleep? His voice was low, almost gentle, but she heard the steel beneath it. Julia sat up, pulling the sheets around her like armor. How could I? The words came out more defiant than she intended. He moved closer, and she caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something darker. Gunpowder, perhaps, or danger itself. His eyes never left her face as he approached, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. You're afraid. It wasn't a question. Shouldn't I be? Julia lifted her chin, refusing to show how much he unnerved her. You've made me a prisoner. A prisoner? His laugh was soft and without humor. No, Bella. You're under my protection. Is there a difference? He sat on the edge of the bed, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Julia fought the urge to move away, knowing it would only show weakness. You don't understand what's happening around you, he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. The men who shot you, they weren't random thugs. They were sent to kill you. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Why? That's what I intend to find out. His hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was surprisingly gentle, at odds with everything she knew about him. Until then, you stay here, where I can keep you safe. She wanted to argue, to tell him she didn't need his protection, but the words died in her throat as his fingers lingered near her cheek. The tension between them shifted, became something else entirely. He stood abruptly, moving toward the door. At the threshold, he paused, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. You're mine now, he said softly, the words falling between them like a promise. He turned to leave, but not before adding, Sleep well, Bella. The evening shadows stretched across Vincenzo's study as he led Julia inside, his hand firm but not cruel against the small of her back. The room breathed old money and power, dark wooden panels, leather-bound books, and the lingering scent of expensive cigars. A crystal decanter caught the light from the desk lamp, amber liquid gleaming inside. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to one of the leather chairs. Julia lowered herself into it, watching as he paced behind his massive mahogany desk. The wound in her side throbbed, a constant reminder of how she'd ended up here. "There are things you need to understand about my world," Vincenzo said, his voice dropping to that dangerous velvet tone that made her skin prickle. "Enemies lurk everywhere. Some wear their threats openly." He paused, dark eyes fixing on her. Others hide behind smiles and handshakes. Julia fought to keep her expression neutral, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Why tell me this?" "Because you're here now." He leaned forward, palms flat on the desk. "And ignorance will get you killed." The way he said it like a simple fact rather than a threat made it worse somehow. Julia wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold on to who she was in this world of shadows and violence. "The men who shot you?" Vincenzo continued, his jaw tightening. "They're just pawns, small pieces, in a much larger game." "What game?" A cold smile touched his lips. "Power. Territory. Control." He moved around the desk, each step measured and predatory. "The old families are restless. They see weakness where there is none, and they probe for soft spots to exploit." Julia felt the weight of his words settle over her like a shroud. She wasn't just a random victim then, she was caught in something bigger, something darker. Vincenzo stopped beside her chair, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne. "Trust no one," he said softly. "Not even those who claim to be allies. In this world, loyalty is bought and sold like any other commodity." She looked up at him, fighting the urge to shrink away. "And what about your loyalty? What's that worth?" Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. He opened his mouth to respond, but his phone buzzed sharply on the desk. The interruption seemed to irritate him, but he reached for it anyway. The change that came over him as he listened was like watching a storm gather. His face hardened, fingers whitening around the phone. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "When?" He growled into the phone. A pause. "Who?" Another pause, longer this time. The muscle in his jaw jumped. Julia watched, transfixed, as the careful control she'd seen in him began to crack. His free hand clenched into a fist, knuckles white with rage. "Find them," he snarled into the phone. "Find them now." The phone hit the desk with enough force to make Julia jump. Vincenzo's chest heaved with barely contained fury as he braced himself against the edge of the desk, head bowed. "What happened?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. When he looked up, Julia's breath caught in her throat. The cold calculation was gone, replaced by something raw and lethal. This wasn't the controlled Mafia boss who'd saved her life. This was a predator, pure and dangerous. "They have my brother," he said, his voice like broken glass. As she watched, he straightened, pulling his gun from its holster with fluid grace. The sound of him checking the chamber echoed in the quiet room. "And they're about to learn why they call me Il Lupo." The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Vincenzo's study, as Julia sat in a plush leather chair, watching men in expensive suits file into the room. Her fingers traced the healing wound at her side, a constant reminder of how she ended up here. The air felt thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken threats. Vincenzo stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his presence commanding attention without effort. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his expression carved from stone. This was his element. Power radiated from him in waves that made even his own men shift uncomfortably in their seats. "The Calabrians are moving shipments through our territory," one of the men reported, his voice tight with concern. "They're testing our borders." Julia watched as Vincenzo's jaw clenched, his hands resting on the table, curled into fists. "Then we send them a message they won't forget," he replied, his voice deadly calm. "No one takes what's mine." Those words made Julia's stomach turn. She'd seen enough in the past few days to understand what such messages entailed. Blood, violence, death. Yet she couldn't deny the strange fascination that kept her eyes fixed on Vincenzo's face, studying the micro-expressions that betrayed his carefully controlled exterior. The meeting continued, discussions of territory and profit margins mixing with casual mentions of violence that made her skin crawl. Through it all, she remained silent, observing how these men, these criminals, operated with the efficiency of any corporate boardroom. When the last man left, Vincenzo turned to her, His dark eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "You're learning," he said, moving closer. "I see you watching, understanding." "Understanding what?" Julia challenged, rising from her chair. "How you destroy lives? How you profit from others' misery?" His laugh was low, without humor. "You think it's so simple? Black and white?" He closed the distance between them, his presence overwhelming. "Everything I do, every life I take, every deal I make, it's all to protect what's mine. My territory, my people." His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheek. "You!" Julia jerked away from his touch, even as her skin tingled where his fingers had been. "I'm not yours," she spat. "I never will be." "No?" He moved with predatory grace, backing her against the wall. "Then why does your heart race when I'm near? Why do you watch me when you think I'm not looking?" Her breath caught in her throat. He was too close, his scent, expensive cologne and something uniquely him, flooding her senses. "That's not— Don't lie to yourself, Bella," he murmured, his lips nearly brushing her ear. "You're drawn to the darkness in me, just as I'm drawn to the light in you." Julia pressed her hands against his chest, pushing him back. "You're wrong. I hate everything you stand for, everything you do." "But you don't hate me," he said with certainty. "That's what terrifies you." She turned away, unable to meet his knowing gaze. Because he was right, she didn't hate him. Despite the violence, despite the criminal empire he commanded, she was beginning to see the man beneath the monster, the way he protected his people, the pain that drove him, the loyalty he inspired. "Your protection comes at too high a price," she whispered. "Everything has a price in this world," he replied. "I simply ensure that those who would harm what's mine pay the highest one of all." His words sent a shiver down her spine, not entirely from fear. She squared her shoulders, lifting her chin defiantly. "I won't be another possession for you to protect, Vincenzo. I won't be owned." The look in his eyes was almost tender, despite the steel in his voice. "You already are, Bella. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." The heavy oak door creaked open, and Julia's breath caught in her throat. Vincenzo stood in the doorway, his normally immaculate suit splattered with dark stains she didn't want to identify. His jaw was tight, a bruise forming along one cheekbone. Their eyes met across the dim room, and the air seemed to crackle with tension. "You're hurt," she said, hating the concern that crept into her voice. "It's nothing." His words were clipped, but his eyes never left her face. Julia took an instinctive step backward as he moved into the room, his presence filling the space like a gathering storm. She could smell leather, gunpowder, and something metallic that made her stomach turn. This was what he was. A man of violence, of power, of blood. "I should go," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She turned toward the door, but his hand shot out, gripping her arm. The touch sent electricity shooting through her body. "Stay." It wasn't a request. "Let me go, Vincenzo." Her voice shook slightly. I can't be here with you like this." His grip didn't loosen, but his thumb began tracing small circles on her skin. The gentle motion contrasted sharply with the violence still evident on his clothes, his face, in the very air around him. "You think you can walk away from this?" His voice was low, dangerous. "From me?" Julia tried to pull away, but her body betrayed her. Instead of fighting, she found herself drawing closer, like a moth to a flame. "This isn't right," she protested weakly. "Nothing about this is right," he agreed, pulling her closer still. His free hand came up to cup her face, surprisingly gentle for a man who dealt in death. "But here we are." The heat of his body seemed to burn through her clothes. She could feel his heart beating, fast and strong, matching the rapid rhythm of her own. His breath fanned across her face, smelling of expensive whiskey and mint. "I hate what you are," she whispered, even as her hands came up to rest against his chest. "No," he said, his eyes darkening. "You hate that you want me anyway." Before she could argue, his mouth crashed down on hers. The kiss was fierce, demanding, stealing her breath and her resistance in one devastating moment. She tried to fight it, tried to remember all the reasons she shouldn't want this man, shouldn't crave his touch. But her body had other ideas. Her lips parted under his, and she heard herself moan as his tongue swept inside. His hand tightened in her hair, angling her head to deepen the kiss. She clutched at his shoulders, no longer sure if she was trying to push him away or pull him closer. The taste of him was intoxicating, dark and dangerous and addictive. His other hand slid down her back, pressing her against him until there wasn't a breath of space between them. She could feel every hard plane of his body, every point where they touched burning like fire. The kiss seemed to go on forever, consuming them both in its intensity. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. His eyes were dark with desire, and she knew hers must mirror the same need. "Tell me again you want to leave," he challenged, his voice rough with want. Julia couldn't speak. Her heart thundered in her chest, and her lips tingled from his kiss. She knew she should run, should fight this attraction that threatened to destroy everything she thought she knew about herself. But in this moment, with his taste on her lips and his hands holding her close, nothing else seemed to matter. Julia paced the length of Vincenzo's study, her fingers trailing along the rich mahogany shelves. The leather-bound books and antique weapons mounted on the walls spoke of old money and older blood. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for him to return from his meeting. She'd spent the morning digging through newspaper archives on her laptop, piecing together the complex web of alliances and betrayals that defined Sicily's underworld. Each article revealed another layer of violence, another connection that made her stomach turn. But it was the photo that made her blood run cold. Her father, Alessandro Vescovi, shaking hands with Carlo Russo, Vincenzo's biggest rival. The door opened with a soft click. Vincenzo strode in, his suit perfectly pressed despite the late hour. His dark eyes found her immediately, narrowing at her tense posture. "You shouldn't be in here," he said, voice low and controlled. Julia lifted her chin. "Why didn't you tell me about my father's connection to the Russos?" Vincenzo stilled, his expression hardening. "How did you find out? Does it matter?" She thrust her phone toward him, showing the damning photograph. "All this time, you knew. You knew exactly who I was when you found me that night." "I knew," he admitted, no trace of remorse in his voice. "Your father's dealings with Russo made you valuable." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Valuable? Is that all I am to you? A bargaining chip? In this world, everything is a game of power." He moved closer, his presence filling the room. "Your father chose his side. He aligned himself with men who would see me dead." Julia's hands trembled. "And what about me? Did I choose this? Did I choose to be caught between your war and my family's betrayal?" "No one chooses this life, Bella." Something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of emotion breaking through his icy facade. "We're born into it, or we're dragged into it. There is no escape. There's always a choice." She spat, even as tears threatened to fall. "You could have let me go that night. You could have let you bleed out on the street." His voice rose slightly. "Let Russo's men finish what they started? Why do you care?" She stepped closer, refusing to be intimidated by his towering presence. "Why pretend this is about protecting me when we both know it's about power?" Vincenzo's jaw clenched. "You think I wanted this?" His control slipped, revealing a flash of raw emotion. "To have you here, caught in the middle of a war you never asked for, to watch you look at me with fear and disgust? Then why keep me here?" Her voice cracked. "Why not just, because I can't let you go?" The words exploded from him, echoing off the walls. For a moment, the mask of the ruthless Mafia boss shattered completely. "I never wanted you involved in this life. But now that you are, now that they know about you." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a rare display of frustration. "There's no going back." Julia shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "I don't believe you. Everything about you is calculated, every move planned. You're using me, just like everyone else in this world." His eyes darkened. "Is that what you think? That I orchestrated your shooting? That I planned to have you stumble into my arms that night? Didn't you?" The silence stretched between them, heavy, with unspoken truths and barely contained emotions. Julia could feel her world crumbling around her. Her father's betrayal, Vincenzo's manipulations, her own conflicted heart that refused to hate him completely. "Not everything in my life is a chess move, Bella," he finally said, his voice softer but no less intense. "Some things just happen, and we deal with the consequences." But Julia had heard enough lies in her life to recognize the taste of them. She turned away, unable to bear the weight of his gaze any longer. Save your pretty words for someone who believes them, Vincenzo. I know exactly what I am to you, a pawn in your game of power. The heavy oak door creaked open as Vincenzo led Giulia up the winding staircase to the mansion's east wing. His hand rested possessively on the small of her back, a touch that both unsettled and thrilled her. The marble steps echoed their footsteps in the dim hallway. Your new room, he said, pushing open an ornate door. More secure than the last one. Giulia stepped inside, her breath catching. The room was twice the size of her previous one, with thick velvet curtains and antique furniture that spoke of old money and power, but her eyes fixed on the reinforced windows and the keypad by the door. Another prison. Just prettier. You can't keep me locked up forever, she said, turning to face him. Vincenzo's dark eyes studied her face. I can, and I will, until I know you're safe. He moved closer, and Giulia backed away until she hit the edge of a mahogany dresser. Your father's dealings with the Calabrese family have put a target on your back. The mention of her father made her stomach twist. I still don't believe you about him. Believe what you want, he said, his voice low and dangerous. But the truth doesn't change. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The gentle gesture contrasted sharply with his harsh words. Giulia jerked away, but her body betrayed her with a shiver at his. Touch. Don't. A ghost of a smile played on his lips. Your body says otherwise, Bella. My body doesn't make my decisions. She snapped, but even as she said it, she felt the familiar pull toward him. The way his presence filled the room, the raw power that emanated from him, it was intoxicating. Vincenzo stepped back, his expression hardening. Get settled. Antonio will bring your dinner shortly. He turned to leave but paused at the door. And Giulia? Don't try anything stupid. The security here is tighter than before. After he left, Giulia explored her new cage. The bathroom was stocked with expensive toiletries, the closet filled with designer clothes in her size. Everything spoke of careful planning, of possession. She hated how much thought he'd put into keeping her here, how thoroughly he'd prepared for her captivity. Hours passed, and night fell. Giulia sat in a plush armchair by the window, watching the garden below, illuminated by security lights. The mansion was quiet, except for the occasional footsteps of guards patrolling the hallways. A shadow moved across the garden. At first, she thought it was one of Vincenzo's men, but the figure moved differently, more predatory, more cautious. Her heart began to race as she realized what she was seeing. Before she could move or call out, the door burst open. Vincenzo strode in, his face a mask of cold fury. Get away from the window, he ordered. The sharp crack of gunfire shattered the night. Glass exploded inward as a bullet pierced the window, missing Giulia by inches. She screamed as Vincenzo tackled her to the floor, his body covering hers protectively. More shots rang out, followed by shouts and running feet. Vincenzo pulled out his gun, his movements precise and lethal. Stay down, he growled, moving toward the broken window. A dark figure appeared in the doorway. The assassin had somehow made it inside. Giulia watched in horror as the man raised his weapon, but Vincenzo was faster. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. The assassin's head snapped back, a spray of red painting the white wall behind him. He crumpled to the floor, his dead eyes staring at nothing. Vincenzo stood over the body, his gun still raised, his breathing steady. Blood spattered his white shirt, but he seemed unconcerned. When he turned to look at Giulia, his eyes were cold and empty, the eyes of a killer. Giulia stared at him, her heart pounding. This was who he really was, not the man who touched her so gently or spoke to her so softly, but a ruthless killer who could end a life without hesitation. Yet even as horror filled her, she couldn't look away. There was something darkly beautiful about him in that moment, something primal and magnetic that drew her in despite herself. The morning sun filtered through the iron-barred windows of Vincenzo's study, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany desk. Giulia stood before it, her hands clenched at her sides as Vincenzo methodically laid out document after document. Your father, Vincenzo said, his voice cold and precise, borrowed 2 million euros from my organization last year. He slid a contract across the desk, her father's signature clearly visible at the bottom. When he couldn't pay, he borrowed more. From my enemies. Giulia's throat tightened. She reached for the paper with trembling fingers, recognizing her father's distinctive scrawl. That's impossible, He would have told me. Would he? Vincenzo rose from his chair, circling the desk until he stood behind her. His presence was overwhelming, the heat of his body radiating against her back. Your father has been playing both sides, Bella, using my money to fund ventures with the Calabrese family. She shook her head, but the evidence was right there in black and white. Bank statements, transfer records, photographs of her father meeting with known rivals. Her world tilted on its axis. I don't understand, she whispered. Why show me? This now? Vincenzo's hand came to rest on her shoulder, heavy and warm. Because you need to understand why you're here. Why I can't let you leave. His fingers traced down her arm, leaving goosebumps in their wake. Your father's debt is now yours. Julia spun to face him, anger flaring in her chest. I'm not responsible for his choices. No, Vincenzo agreed, his dark eyes holding hers. But you are the only thing of value he has left to offer. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The gentle gesture contrasted sharply with his next words. The Calabrese family wants you dead. Your father's betrayal signed your death warrant. The reality of her situation crashed over her like a wave. She wasn't just a captive anymore. She was a pawn in a game much bigger than herself. So what am I to you? A hostage? Collateral? Vincenzo's expression softened slightly, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Your protection, Julia. As long as you're here, under my guard, your father can't make any more foolish decisions, and the Calabrese family can't touch you. She laughed bitterly. How generous of you. Generosity has nothing to do with it. His hand cupped her cheek, thumb brushing across her lower lip. You're an asset, one I intend to keep. The possessiveness in his touch sent shivers down her spine. She tried to step back, but his other hand caught her waist, holding her in place. The heat between them was undeniable, a current of electricity that made her breath catch. I won't be owned, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Vincenzo's lips curved into a knowing smile. You already are, Bella. His grip tightened slightly. The sooner you accept your place here, the easier this will be. She could feel her resolve weakening, her body betraying her as it leaned into his touch. The monster who held her captive shouldn't feel like safety. But he did. His presence was becoming as necessary as air. You're mine, he said softly, the words a caress against her skin. And you'll learn to want to stay here. The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Vincenzo's study, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where Julia sat, her fingers tracing the edge of a leather folder. Inside were documents that made her stomach turn, detailed records of her father's dealings with the rival Castelli family. Vincenzo stood by the window, his broad shoulders tense as he spoke into his phone in rapid Italian. His voice was controlled, but Julia had learned to read the subtle signs of his anger, the tightening around his eyes, the way his free hand clenched and unclenched at his side. 3 of his captains lounged in the leather chairs across the room, their casual postures belied by the guns visible beneath their expensive suits. They watched her with calculating eyes, as if measuring how much trouble she might cause. Your father borrowed 2 million euros from the Castellis, Vincenzo said after ending, his call, turning to face her. Money he couldn't repay, so he offered them something else instead, information about my operations. Julia's hands trembled as she flipped through the papers. Bank statements, surveillance photos, transcripts of meetings, all evidence of her father's betrayal. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would he? Because he's weak, Vincenzo cut in, his voice sharp. He moved behind her chair, his presence overwhelming. And the weak will always seek protection from those they think can save them. But the Castellis don't protect, they destroy. A knock at the door interrupted them. One of Vincenzo's men entered, dragging a struggling figure. Julia's breath caught. It was Marco, her father's accountant. His face was bruised, his expensive suit torn. Tell her what you told me, Vincenzo commanded, his hand coming to rest on Julia's shoulder. His touch was possessive, a reminder of her position in this dangerous game. Marco's eyes darted. Between them, terror evident in his expression. Your father. He's been feeding information to the Castellis for months. Routes, schedules, names of loyal men. They promised to protect him when they made their move against Don Romano. Julia felt sick. Every word was another betrayal, another crack in the foundation of everything she'd believed about her family. She tried to stand, but Vincenzo's grip tightened, keeping her in place. "Watch," he ordered as one of his captains approached Marco. The questioning that followed was brutal, efficient. Marco broke quickly, spilling details about planned attacks, corrupt police officers, hidden accounts. Each revelation made the air in the room heavier, more oppressive. Vincenzo's men moved with practiced precision, recording information, making calls, setting plans in motion. This was their world, a world of violence and power, where loyalty was everything and betrayal meant death. "Your father's actions have consequences," Vincenzo said softly, his fingers sliding from her shoulder to brush against her neck. "The Castellis will come for what they think is theirs. They'll use anyone, including you, to get to me." Giulia watched as Marco was led away, his fate already sealed. She understood now why Vincenzo had made her witness this. It wasn't just about showing her the truth about her father. It was about showing her the reality of the world she now inhabited. "There's no way out," Vincenzo said, his voice a mix of threat and promise. His hand cupped her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You're part of this now, whether you want to be or not. The only question is whether you'll accept my protection willingly, or if I'll have to force you to take it." The truth of his words settled over her like a heavy cloak. She was trapped in a world where mercy was weakness and violence was currency. A world where the man behind her was both her captor and her shield, the devil who might be her only salvation. Giulia's fingers trembled as she held the documents she'd found hidden in Vincenzo's study. The papers had slipped from a folder marked with her father's name, scattered across the mahogany desk like fallen leaves. Each page revealed a deeper betrayal, a web of lies that made her stomach turn. Her father's signature graced the bottom of contracts with Vincenzo's rivals, the Castellano family. Not just recent dealings, but arrangements spanning years. Her eyes caught dates, numbers, and names that painted a devastating picture. Her father hadn't just done business with them. He'd been feeding them information about Vincenzo's operations all along. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her pulse quicken, but she couldn't stop reading. Another document showed a transaction from 3 weeks ago, right before she was shot. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Her father had known she would be targeted. He had known and said nothing. "I thought I might find you." "Here," a deep voice said from the doorway. Giulia's head snapped up to find Marco, one of Vincenzo's most trusted men, watching her with knowing eyes. He didn't seem surprised to find her snooping through confidential files. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marco stepped into the room, his expression grim. "The boss has been tracking your father's movements for months. The shooting wasn't random, Giulia. They wanted you alive, wanted you to end up exactly where you are now." The room spun slightly. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. "My own father used me as bait?" "The Castellanos needed leverage against Vincenzo. Your father saw an opportunity." Marco's words were gentle but cut like knives. "They knew Vincenzo would protect you once you were in his territory. They're counting on it." Giulia sank into the leather chair behind her. The documents clutched to her chest. The luxury of the study felt suffocating now. The Persian rugs, the rare books lining the walls, the crystal decanter of whiskey catching the afternoon light. All of it, a beautiful prison. "There's more," Marco continued, pulling another folder from inside his jacket. "Your father's been meeting with them regularly since you've been here, planning something big." Her hands shook as she opened the new folder. Inside were surveillance photos, her father meeting with known members of the Castellano family in secret locations. The timestamps showed meetings as recent as yesterday. The door burst open again, and Giulia knew without looking that it was Vincenzo. His presence filled the room like a storm cloud, dark and electric. She could feel his eyes on her, taking in the scene, the scattered papers, her pale face, the truth laid bare between them. "You weren't supposed to find out like this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. When she finally looked up at him, she saw anger in his eyes, but it wasn't directed at her. There was something else there too, a flash of what might have been regret, or perhaps protection. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling her up from the chair and into his arms. His touch was possessive but gentle, and despite everything, she found herself leaning into him. "I will protect you from the men who betrayed you," he whispered against her hair, his words both a promise and a threat. Giulia closed her eyes, feeling the solid warmth of him against her. She was trapped in a game where every player had their own agenda, where trust was as fragile as glass and just as sharp when broken. And now she realized she was in deeper than she'd ever imagined, caught between her father's betrayal and Vincenzo's dangerous protection. The papers slipped from her fingers, floating to the floor like surrender. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Vincenzo's study, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Maps and documents littered his massive desk, each one marked with precise annotations in his sharp handwriting. Julia watched from the doorway as he bent over the papers, his shoulders tense beneath his tailored suit jacket. His men filed in and out of the room, their faces grim as they delivered updates and received orders. The air crackled with anticipation and dread. Julia could feel it. Something big was coming. Something final. "The warehouse is secured," one of his captains reported. "We've confirmed their location." Vincenzo nodded, his jaw clenched. "And their numbers?" "At least 30 men, heavily armed." A muscle twitched in Vincenzo's cheek. He traced a line on the map with his finger, his movements calculated and precise. Even now, planning what would surely be a bloodbath, he maintained that iron control that defined him. But Julia saw something else, in the way his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee, in how his eyes would occasionally drift to the framed photo of his mother on the desk. This wasn't just business for him. Like this was personal. "You don't have to do this," Julia said softly, once they were alone. He looked up at her, his dark eyes haunted. "Yes, I do. They threatened what's mine." His voice dropped lower. "They threatened you." She moved closer, drawn to him despite herself. The morning sun caught the silver at his temples, reminding her that beneath the monster everyone feared was just a man who'd been forged in violence but still carried wounds that wouldn't heal. "Your father's betrayal." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "It goes deeper than you know. He's been feeding information to my enemies for years. Every attack, every attempt on my life, he was behind it all." The truth hit Julia like a physical blow. She steadied herself against his desk, her fingers brushing the cool wood. "Why tell me this now? Because after today, nothing will be the same." He stood, moving around the desk to stand before her. "I'm ending this war once and for all." His men began gathering outside, their vehicles lining up in the circular driveway. The sound of engines rumbling filled the morning air. Julia could see them through the window, dark suits and darker expressions, weapons barely concealed beneath expensive jackets. Vincenzo checked his own weapon, the movement practiced and efficient. But there was something different about him today, a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He looked at her, and for a moment, his mask slipped completely. "I never wanted this life for you," he said quietly. "But now that you're in it, I'll burn the world down to keep you safe." The raw honesty in his voice made her breath catch. This was the real Vincenzo, not the cold-blooded mafia boss, but the man who'd been shaped by loss and betrayal into something both terrible and magnificent. His men were waiting. The time had come. Vincenzo straightened his tie, his walls going back up as he prepared to become Il Lupo once more. But, before he could step away, Julia caught his hand. He entwined his fingers with hers, squeezing tightly. His touch was warm, anchoring her in this moment before the storm. She could feel his pulse racing beneath his skin, betraying the tension coiled within him. "Stay close, Bella," he said, his voice low and intense. "This ends today." The night air crackled with tension as gunfire erupted across the warehouse district. Julia crouched behind a stack of wooden crates, her heart hammering against her ribs. The metallic scent of blood mixed with gunpowder filled her nostrils, making her stomach turn. Through gaps in the crates, she watched Vincenzo move with lethal grace. His men followed his silent hand signals, spreading out through the maze of containers and abandoned buildings. His usual perfectly tailored suit was gone, replaced by tactical gear that made him look even more dangerous. A bullet whizzed past, splintering wood inches from her head. Julia pressed herself flat against the concrete floor, trying to make herself as small as possible. The sound of automatic weapons filled the air, punctuated by shouts and screams. "Move in!" Vincenzo's voice cut through the chaos, commanding and cold. His men advanced like a well-oiled machine, taking ground methodically. Bodies began to fall, rival soldiers dropping one by one under the precision of Vincenzo's assault. Julia's hands trembled as she witnessed the brutality unfold. This wasn't just business, this was war. Vincenzo had warned her it would be bloody, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality. His movements were calculated and merciless, each shot finding its mark with deadly accuracy. The rival family's men started falling back, but Vincenzo pressed forward relentlessly. He caught one man trying to flee and dispatched him with a single shot. His face showed no emotion, just cold determination. This was the man she'd first met, Il Lupo, the Wolf of Sicily. More gunfire erupted from a second-story window. Vincenzo's men took cover, returning fire in coordinated bursts. Glass shattered, raining down on the pavement. Through it all, Vincenzo remained focused, directing his forces with hand signals and short, sharp commands. The fighting intensified around a corner of the warehouse. Giulia heard the distinctive sound of a grenade pin being pulled. "Down!" Vincenzo shouted. The explosion rocked the building, sending debris and dust everywhere. When it cleared, Vincenzo emerged from the smoke like an avenging angel, his gun steady as he advanced. Blood ran in rivulets across the concrete floor. The screams of the wounded mixed with the continuing gunfire. Giulia watched as Vincenzo systematically eliminated every threat, his movements precise and economical. There was no hesitation, no mercy, only the cold efficiency of a man who'd been forged in violence. The battle seemed to last forever, though it couldn't have been more than 30 minutes. Gradually, the gunfire died down. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the fighting. Giulia could hear her own rapid breathing, the pounding of her heart. Through the settling dust and smoke, Vincenzo's figure emerged. His tactical gear was splattered with blood, his face streaked with grime. But his eyes, those piercing eyes, found her immediately. He moved toward her with purposeful strides, holstering his weapon. Giulia stood on shaky legs as he approached. This was the man who'd killed without hesitation, who'd orchestrated this symphony of violence. Yet when he reached for her, his touch was gentle. His strong arms wrapped around her, pulling her against his chest. She could feel his heart beating, fast but steady, as he held her. The promise in his eyes was clear. She was his to protect, his to cherish, even if it meant painting the streets red with the blood of his enemies. In that moment, covered in the evidence of his brutality, he'd never looked more powerful, or more vulnerable. Blood from his gear smeared onto her clothes as he held her. But Giulia didn't pull away. This was his world. Their world. Now. In all its violent glory. His victory meant their survival, and the bodies cooling on the concrete floor were the price of their safety. Vincenzo's breath was warm against her ear as he held her close, his victory complete but meaningless without her in his arms. Around them, his men secured the area, but Giulia could only focus on the solid strength of his embrace and the unspoken promise in those dangerous eyes. The mansion's library felt different tonight. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the leather-bound books and antique furniture. Giulia stood by the window, her fingers tracing patterns on the cold glass. The events of the past few hours had left her shaken, but something else lingered in the air, a shift in the careful dance she'd been performing with Vincenzo. He entered silently, as he always did, but tonight his footsteps were heavy with purpose. When she turned to face him, she noticed his usual mask of cold indifference had cracked. His dark eyes held an intensity that made her breath catch. "Do you know why I keep you here?" His voice was low, almost gentle, so unlike his usual commanding tone. Giulia wrapped her arms around herself. "Because I'm useful. Because of my father's debts. Because—" "No." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, closing the distance between them. His hand reached up, cupping her face with a tenderness that surprised her. "Because the thought of you being hurt." He paused, jaw clenching. "It drives me mad." Her heart thundered in her chest. This wasn't the Vincenzo she knew, the ruthless Mafia boss who commanded armies with a single look. This was someone else entirely. "I've watched men die without blinking," he continued, his thumb brushing her cheek. "I've built my empire on blood and bone. But you," his voice cracked, slightly, "you make me weak." Giulia tried to step back, but found herself trapped between his body and the window. "Don't say that." "Why not?" His eyes searched hers. "Because it terrifies you? Because it terrifies me?" He let out a harsh laugh. "I am Il Lupo, the wolf, the most feared man in Sicily. And yet here I am, brought to my knees by a woman who hates everything I stand for. I don't hate you, Julia whispered, surprising herself with the truth in those words. His hand slid to her neck, his touch sending shivers down her spine. Then what do you feel, Bella? Tell me. She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by his proximity, by the heat radiating from his body. I feel lost, confused. You're everything I shouldn't want, everything I was taught to run from. But I can't stop thinking about you, about the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching, about how gentle your hands can be, even though I've seen them covered in blood. Vincenzo's breath hitched. He pressed his forehead against hers, their lips mere inches apart. I would burn this whole city to the ground to keep you safe. I would kill every man who dared to look at you wrong, not because you're mine, though you are, but because I. He struggled with the words, emotions warring across his face. Because what? Julia pressed, her hands finding their way to his chest, feeling his heartbeat racing beneath her palm. Because I love you. The words came out rough, almost angry. God help me. I love you more than power, more than vengeance, more than my own life. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Julia felt tears prick at her eyes. All this time, she'd thought she was just a pawn in his games, a useful piece to be moved across the board. But the raw vulnerability in his voice, the trembling of his hands as they held her, this was real. He pulled back slightly, studying her face. Say something, Bella, even if it's to tell me you hate me. Instead of speaking, Julia raised herself on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, but quickly grew desperate. Vincenzo's arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against him, as if he could somehow make them one person, erase all the space between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Julia rested her head against his chest. The world outside was still dangerous, still filled with enemies and violence, but here, in this moment, she felt safe, protected, loved. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. Of me? Of how much I feel for you. Of how right this feels, even though it shouldn't. His arms tightened around her. Then be scared with me, Bella. Let me protect you. Let me love you. In response, she simply held him closer, breathing in his scent, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. The moon continued its journey across the sky, casting their intertwined shadows across the library floor. A perfect union of light and darkness. Through the ornate windows of Vincenzo's study, the Sicilian sunset painted the sky in shades of blood orange and deep purple. Julia stood before the massive mahogany desk, her fingers trailing along its polished surface as she watched Vincenzo pour 2 glasses of amber liquor. The events of the past few hours weighed heavily on her mind. The streets outside still echoed with the aftermath of violence. Yet here, in this room, time seemed suspended. The air between them crackled with unspoken words and decisions yet to be made. You could leave, Vincenzo said quietly, his voice lacking its usual commanding edge. He handed her one of the crystal glasses, his fingers brushing against hers. I would not stop you now. Julia took a slow sip, letting the expensive bourbon burn down her throat. Her old life beckoned, a world of relative safety, of predictable days and quiet nights. But that world seemed hollow now, like a faded photograph of someone else's. Life. Would you really let me go? She asked, studying his face. Vincenzo moved closer, his presence both threatening and comforting. I am many things, Bella. A liar is not one of them. The weight of his words hung between them. Julia remembered the violence she'd witnessed, the blood that had been spilled. Yet she also remembered his gentle touches, the way his eyes softened when they were alone, how he'd risked everything to protect her. The world out there, he continued, gesturing to the window. It's not kind to people like me. You've seen what I am, what I do. His jaw tightened. But with you, I want to be more than just Il Lupo. Julia set down her glass and stepped closer to him. The scent of his cologne mixed with gunpowder still clung to his shirt. And what would I be, Vincenzo? Another possession? Another piece in your empire? His dark eyes flashed. You know better than that. He reached out, his calloused fingers tracing her jawline. You've never been just anything to me. The truth of it resonated in her bones. Since that first night when she'd stumbled into him, bleeding and terrified, something had sparked between them. something that defied the simple labels of captor and captive, predator and prey. "Your world is dangerous," she whispered, leaning into his touch despite herself. "Yes." His honesty was brutal, refreshing. "But you've already proven you're stronger than you think." Memories flooded her mind. The way she'd stood up to him, challenged him, forced him to see her as more than just another pawn in his game. She'd changed him as much as he'd changed her. "And what about love?" she asked, her heart thundering in her chest. "Is there room for that in your world of violence and power?" Vincenzo's hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her closer until their foreheads nearly touched. "Love is the most dangerous game of all, Bella. But for you," his voice dropped to a whisper, "for you, I would risk everything." The choice crystallized before her. She could walk away, return to a life that no longer felt real, or she could embrace this new reality, one filled with danger and passion, violence and protection, fear and love so intense it threatened to consume her. Looking into Vincenzo's eyes, she saw not just the ruthless mafia boss, but the man beneath, the one who'd shown her his scars, who'd trusted her with his vulnerabilities, who'd moved heaven and earth to keep her safe. Her heart had made its decision long before her mind caught up. The world she'd known before seemed pale and distant compared to the vibrant, dangerous life that awaited her with him. "I'm yours, Vincenzo," she said, the words falling from her lips like a prayer, like a promise. His smile was fierce and possessive as he pulled her into a passionate kiss, claiming her completely. His lips moved against hers with an intensity that spoke of possession, protection, and a love that defied the darkness of their world. The morning sun streamed through the mansion's bulletproof windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Giulia stood in Vincenzo's office, watching him work at his massive mahogany desk. The air between them crackled with an electric tension that had evolved from fear to something far more dangerous: desire. Papers scattered across his desk detailed the new alliances formed in the wake of the bloodshed. The rival families had either bent the knee or been eliminated. Vincenzo's empire now stretched further than ever before, and yet his focus remained on her, his dark eyes lifting to meet hers every few moments as if to ensure she hadn't vanished. "Come here," he commanded softly, pushing back from his desk. Giulia approached him slowly, her heart thundering against her ribs. She was no longer the terrified woman who had stumbled into his world bleeding and desperate. The past weeks had changed her, hardened her edges while softening her heart to this complex man. "The Rossi family signed the agreement this morning," he said, pulling her onto his lap. His touch was possessive, yet gentle. "The Calabrese clan has retreated to their territory. Everything is falling into place." "And what about us?" Giulia asked, her fingers trailing along his jaw. "Where do we fall in this new order of yours?" Vincenzo's grip tightened on her waist. "You know exactly where you belong, Bella, where you've always belonged." The warmth of his hand seeped through her silk blouse, reminding her of all the nights they'd shared, all the moments when his cruel facade had cracked to reveal the man beneath. She'd seen him kill without mercy, yet tend to her wounds with the gentlest touch. She'd witnessed his ruthlessness in business, yet felt the tender way he held her while she slept. "I used to think I could escape this world," she admitted, watching his expression darken. "That I could run from what I felt for you. And now?" His voice was rough with emotion. "Now I understand that some chains are meant to be worn." She pressed closer to him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her palm. "That sometimes being captured means being set free." A knock at the door interrupted them. One of Vincenzo's men entered, stopping short at the sight of them. "Boss, the Moretti family is here for the meeting." Vincenzo nodded, his expression shifting back to the cold mask of the feared mafia boss. But his touch remained gentle as he helped Giulia to her feet. "Wait for me in our room," he murmured against her ear. "This won't take long." She watched him transform fully into Il Lupo, the wolf who ruled the underworld with an iron fist. Yet she alone knew the man beneath the monster, the one who whispered love against her skin in the dead of night, who had killed to protect her, and would do so again without hesitation. As she made her way through the mansion's halls, guards nodded respectfully. They no longer saw her as a captive, but as their boss's woman, someone to be protected at all costs. The power of her position should have frightened her, but instead, it felt right, like slipping into a role she was always meant to play. In their bedroom, she went to the window, looking out over the sprawling grounds of the estate. This place had been her prison, but now it was her kingdom. She thought of her old life, of the fear and uncertainty that had plagued her every step. Here, in the heart of darkness, she had found something unexpected: security, power, and a love so fierce it burned away her doubts. Vincenzo's footsteps in the hallway pulled her from her thoughts. He entered the room like a storm, his presence filling every corner. Without a word, he crossed to her, spinning her to face him. His eyes blazed with possession as he cupped her face in his hands. His grip tightened, not enough to hurt, but enough to remind her of his strength. "You're mine, forever," he declared, and she knew it was true. The morning sun filtered through the bulletproof windows of Vincenzo's mansion, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Giulia stood at the window, watching his men patrol the grounds with practiced precision. 6 months had passed since the bloody war that had cemented Vincenzo's power, and their world had settled into a dangerous but stable rhythm. "You're up early, Bella," Vincenzo's voice carried across the room as he approached, still adjusting his suit cuffs. His presence filled the space, commanding as ever, but there was a softness in his eyes reserved only for her. "I couldn't sleep," Giulia admitted, turning to face him. The sight of him still made her breath catch, the dangerous grace, the controlled power in every movement. "The Calabrese family signed the agreement?" Vincenzo's lips curved into a satisfied smile. "Last night. The southern territories are secure." He reached for her, pulling her against his chest. His touch was possessive, but gentle. "No one dares challenge us. Now." Giulia relaxed into his embrace, remembering how far they'd come. The terror of those first days felt like a lifetime ago. Now, she moved through his world with confidence, understanding the delicate balance of power that kept their empire standing. "Your father's old associates have been quiet," Vincenzo continued, his fingers trailing down her spine. "They finally understood the message I sent." The message had been 3 bodies left on the steps of Sicily's oldest cathedral. Giulia should have been horrified, but she'd learned to accept the violence that kept them safe. "And the Russian connection?" "Secured through marriage. Carlo's wedding to their boss's daughter next month will seal the alliance." Vincenzo's hand tightened slightly at her waist, though my own marriage was far more advantageous. Their wedding had been a show of power, the feared Mafia boss, and the woman who'd tamed him. Hundreds had attended, all paying respects to the couple who now controlled most of Sicily's underworld. The gold ring on Giulia's finger caught the morning light, a symbol of both love and authority. A knock at the door interrupted them. Marco, Vincenzo's most trusted lieutenant, entered with a tablet in hand. "Boss, we've got movement from the Rizzo family. They're mobilizing in Palermo." Vincenzo's expression hardened instantly. The Rizzos were the last remnants of the old guard, too stubborn to accept the new order. "Numbers? 20 men, heavily armed. They're heading toward the port." Giulia felt Vincenzo's muscles tense. The port was their most crucial territory, the gateway for their legitimate and illegitimate business interests. An attack there would be a direct challenge to their authority. "Get the men ready," Vincenzo ordered, his voice cold. "We end this today." "Already done, boss. Teams are in position." As Marco left, Vincenzo turned back to Giulia. The tenderness from moments before was replaced by the calculated fury that had made him feared throughout Italy. "Stay here," he commanded. "The mansion is secure." "No." Giulia met his gaze firmly. "I'm coming with you. This affects both of us now." A flash of pride crossed his face. This was the woman he'd created, strong enough to stand beside him in his brutal world. "Very well. But you stay in the car with doubled security." Within minutes, they were speeding toward the port in a convoy of black SUVs. Giulia watched the city blur past, remembering how she'd once tried to escape these same vehicles. Now, she was exactly where she wanted to be. Vincenzo spoke quietly into his phone, coordinating his men's positions. His free hand never left hers, thumb stroking her knuckles in an unconscious gesture of possession and protection. This was their life now. Moments of tenderness woven between acts of necessary violence. The port came into view, the morning sun glinting off the Mediterranean. Vincenzo's men were already in position, hidden among the shipping, containers, and warehouses. The Rizzo family's attempted show of force would be their last mistake. "Whatever happens," Vincenzo said softly, his eyes fixed on the port entrance, "remember that everything I do is to protect what's ours. Julia squeezed his hand. I know. And she did. The monster she'd once feared had become her protector, her lover, her everything. Their world might be built on blood and power, but their love was the strongest foundation of all. The golden Sicilian sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Vincenzo's study, casting long shadows across the Persian rug. Julia stood by the window, watching the guards patrol the perimeter of the estate. Their presence no longer made her feel like a prisoner. Now they represented safety, protection, the careful web Vincenzo had woven around their life together. She heard his familiar footsteps behind her, followed by the gentle clink of crystal as he set down 2 glasses of aged whiskey. His arms encircled, hit her waist, pulling her back against his chest. The familiar scent of his cologne, mixed with leather and tobacco, wrapped around her like a comfort blanket. What's on your mind, Bella? His voice rumbled against her ear, sending a pleasant shiver down her spine. Everything feels different now, she admitted, leaning into his embrace. Quieter. Vincenzo's chest rose and fell in a deep breath. The families have accepted their new positions. They know better than to challenge us now. Julia turned in his arms, studying the face that had once terrified her. The sharp angles of his jaw, the darkness in his eyes that could still strike fear into the hearts of his enemies. But now she saw beyond that. She saw the slight softening around his mouth when he looked at her, the gentle way his hands always found her. I never thought I'd find peace in this world, she said, reaching up to trace the scar along his cheek, a reminder of the battles they'd survived together. He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. There is no peace without power, amore, and now we have both. Moving to the leather couch, Vincenzo pulled her down beside him. The evening light painted everything in warm amber tones, softening the edges of their dangerous world. He handed her one of the crystal glasses, the amber liquid catching the light. Do you remember the night we met? He asked, his voice taking on that dangerous edge she'd come to associate with his darker memories. How could I forget? I was bleeding out on your territory. She took a sip of the whiskey, letting it warm her from within. I thought you were going to kill me. His laugh was low and dark. Instead, you became my weakness. His fingers traced patterns on her thigh, and my strength. Julia set her glass down, turning to face him fully. I fought so hard against this life, against you. And now? His eyes held hers, intense and possessive. Now I understand what it means to belong here, to belong to you. She reached for him, her fingers sliding into his hair. The violence, the power, the responsibility. It's all part of who we are. Vincenzo pulled her onto his lap, his hands spanning her waist. You've adapted well, my little fighter. You've learned to navigate our world without losing yourself. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the coiled power that made him so dangerous to others. But his touch remained gentle as he traced her spine, a contrast that still fascinated her. The other families respect you now, he continued. They see what I saw from the beginning, your strength, your intelligence. They fear what you'd do to protect me, she corrected with a knowing smile. As they should. His grip tightened possessively. Everything I've built, everything I am, it's all yours now too, Julia. The empire, the power, the protection. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. In these quiet moments, she could almost forget the blood that had been spilled to get them here, the bodies that had paved their path to peace. Almost. I wouldn't change it, she whispered against his lips. Any of it. The fear, the fighting, the way you claimed me, it all led us here. His kiss was soft but commanding, a reminder of the authority he wielded, even in their most intimate moments. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark with possession and pride. You're mine, Bella, forever. Forever, she agreed, settling against his chest as the Sicilian sunset painted their world in shades of gold and shadow. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Vincenzo's study, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. Julia stood at the window, watching the guards patrol the perimeter of the estate with practiced precision. 6 months had passed since the bloody war that had solidified Vincenzo's power, and still, she marveled at how different her life had become. Behind her, Vincenzo worked at his massive mahogany desk, the soft scratch of his pen against paper, a familiar comfort. He no longer tried to shield her from the business side of his world. She had earned her place here, not just as his woman, but as his equal. Come here, Bella, Vincenzo called, his voice softer than it used to be. The edge was still there. It would always be there, but now it carried warmth when he spoke to her. Giulia crossed the room, her bare feet silent on the expensive carpet. She wore one of his shirts, the white fabric swimming on her frame, and a pair of silk pajama shorts. These quiet morning moments were precious, before the day's demands took hold. Vincenzo pushed back from his desk, creating space for her to perch on his lap. His arms encircled her waist, and she felt the tension in his muscles slowly release. Even now, he only truly relaxed when she was close. "What troubles you?" she asked, running her fingers through his dark hair. The silver at his temples had increased over the past months, but it only made him more striking. "Nothing troubles me anymore," he replied, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "Not when I have you." Giulia smiled, remembering the cold, brutal man who had first taken her captive. The man who had demanded her submission, who had terrified her with his capacity for violence. That man still existed. She had watched him execute a traitor just last week, but he had evolved, learned to balance his nature with something gentler. "Liar," she teased, turning in his lap to face him. "I saw the reports from Naples." Vincenzo's eyes darkened slightly, but his grip on her remained gentle. "Nothing I can't handle." "Nothing we can't handle," she corrected, earning a rare smile from him. "Si, amor. We." His hand traced up her spine, coming to rest at the nape of her neck. "You've changed everything." The words held weight. In the beginning, she had fought against this life with everything she had. Now, she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The violence and danger were still present, but she had learned to navigate them, to find strength in the protection Vincenzo offered, while maintaining her own identity. "You changed everything too," she admitted, resting her forehead against his. "I never thought I could love someone like you." "Someone like me?" His voice carried a hint of amusement. "A monster?" "A man," she corrected, "who would burn the world to keep me safe, who learned to show mercy because I asked it of him, who holds me like I'm precious but treats me as an equal." Vincenzo's eyes softened, something that only happened when they were alone. His thumb traced her bottom lip, a gesture that still made her heart race. "You are precious and dangerous." His other hand tightened possessively on her hip. "My beautiful contradiction." Giulia leaned into his touch, remembering how she had once flinched from it. Now, his hands represented safety, passion, belonging. "Your beautiful contradiction, who knows all your secrets and loves you. Anyway." The smile that curved his lips was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that transformed his entire face. These were the moments that made everything worth it. The danger, the violence, the responsibility of being the woman who stood beside Sicily's most feared man. Vincenzo pulled her closer, his kiss soft but possessive. When he pulled back, his expression was serious. "I never thought I could have this," he admitted. "Peace, trust. You." Giulia understood. In their world, trust was a rare commodity, peace even rarer. But together, they had carved out something unique, a love that was both gentle and fierce, a partnership built on mutual strength rather than submission. The sun continued its journey across the sky, painting the room in warm gold. Outside, the business of their empire continued, but in this moment, they were just a man and a woman who had found something precious in the shadows. The Sicilian sunrise painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, its warm light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Vincenzo's estate. Giulia stood at the balcony, her fingers wrapped around a delicate coffee cup, watching as the new day chased away the last remnants of darkness. The morning air carried the scent of jasmine from the garden below, a gentle reminder of how much had changed since she first arrived here as a prisoner. Behind her, she heard Vincenzo's familiar footsteps. His presence no longer sparked fear in her heart. Instead, it brought a warmth that spread through her chest like honey. He approached with the silent grace of a predator, but his touch was gentle as he wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about, Bella?" His breath tickled her ear, and she leaned back against his solid chest. "How different everything is now," she murmured, setting down her coffee cup. "I remember being so terrified of you, of this place." Vincenzo's chest rumbled with a low chuckle. "And now?" She turned in his arms, studying the face that had once seemed so cold and cruel. The sharp angles were still there. The dangerous glint in his eyes hadn't dimmed, but she could see beyond that now. She saw the man who would burn the world down to protect her, who had shown her that even in darkness, love could bloom. "Now I understand," she said, reaching up to trace the scar along his jaw. "This is where I belong." His eyes darkened with possession, and he caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You've changed me, Julia." The admission came quietly, like a secret meant only for her. "I never thought I needed anyone until you stumbled into my life, bleeding and defiant." She smiled at the memory, no longer bitter. "You were such a bastard." "I still am," he reminded her, but his lips quirked up. "Just a bastard who belongs to you." The sound of cars approaching drew their attention. Below, his men were arriving for the morning briefing, a reminder that while their love had transformed them both, the dangerous world they inhabited remained unchanged. Vincenzo's empire still required his iron fist, his ruthlessness. But that was okay now. Julia had learned to accept both sides of him, the tender lover, who held her through the night, and the ruthless mafia boss, who commanded respect through fear, just as he had accepted both her strength and vulnerability. "Your men are waiting," she said, smoothing his perfectly pressed shirt. Vincenzo caught her hand, holding it against his heart. "Let them wait." His other hand cupped her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I need this moment with you." The tenderness in his touch made her breath catch. This was the side of him that only she got to see, the man beneath the monster, the heart behind the ruthless exterior. She had fought so hard against falling for him, against accepting this life, but now she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. "I love you," she whispered, the words still new enough to make her heart race. "Even when you're being impossible." "Especially then," he smirked, before his expression grew serious. "You're the only one who's ever seen past my walls, Julia. The only one who wasn't afraid to challenge me, to make me want to be better." She pressed closer, breathing in his expensive cologne mixed with something uniquely him. "You don't need to be better. You just need to be mine." His grip tightened possessively. "Always, Bella. Always yours." His eyes held hers, intense and unwavering, "just as you're mine." They stood together at the balcony, watching as Sicily came alive below them. The warmth of the sun wrapped around them like a blessing, while the distant sound of waves reminded them of how far they'd come. From captor and captive to two halves of the same soul, their love had survived betrayal, violence, and their own resistance. As Vincenzo drew her closer, his heartbeat steady against her cheek, he whispered the words that sealed their fate. "You're mine forever." Julia smiled, knowing that in his dangerous world, they had found their redemption. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.